a little bit of lead time. Like we're starting to record right now. Hi, Mandy, who's our executive secretary. She is going to crop this to make it look good at the beginning and the end. So we just give her a little bit of lead time on that. And then you are the president of the Nebraska School Social Workers Association.
Mm-hmm.
Want to make sure I get that correct. Okay. Whenever you're ready, you tell me and I'll introduce.
I am good.
Okay. Well, welcome to one. I'm going to start over because I had to scratch my eyebrow.
Yeah, with questions at the end, do you want, like, if you have some, will you put them in like the chat, or do you want me just to?
Yes, I will absolutely do that.
Okay.
And then you'll be able to see the chat, I believe.
Yep.
And answer some questions there. All right. Okay. And I believe I'm going to make sure that I get our series correct here. I think it's equity, diversity, and inclusivity, but I'm going to get that wrong because I would. Where is at? Work. Because I always get it backwards. I get something out of order. Here we go. Equity, diversity, and inclusion series. There we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another one of our webinars in our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion series here with the Nebraska School Librarians Association. Let me try that again. Okay, welcome everyone to another one of the webinars in our Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion series. We are excited to welcome Molly Schnabel, who is the current president of the Nebraska School Social Workers Association, to speak with us about homeless services in the school setting. Thank you, Molly. We appreciate you being with us.
Yes, I'm very excited to be here. As I was saying, I generally don't get asked to present on topics like this. It's usually more geared towards mental health, crisis intervention. And so actually this is a huge part of my role as a school social worker. So I'm excited to share some information with you that I do think that all school staff employees should know about and be educated on. Before I get started, just a little bit about me so that you know where I'm coming from on this. I am a school social worker with the Plain La Vista Community Schools, and I am at a high school and an alternative high school. I split my time between the two. And so that's really where my perspective comes from mostly. But when you're talking about homelessness, you're also talking about whole family classification. So I work with the whole family, and so I work with the younger kids too. So with that, we'll just jump right in. Okay, so when we're talking about homelessness in the school setting, we cannot talk about it without talking about this McKinneyVento Homeless Assistance Act. It is the guiding light for everything that we do that determines how and what we provide for families that are coded as homeless within our school district. And so I feel like sometimes people feel like homelessness is a linear process, right? We identify them, we get resources, and then here's what you're eligible for. And instead, it was hard for me to pick the order of the slides, honestly, because there are so many different tangents that homelessness can go and ways that people are classified. And so I felt like this was just a really good way to start because there are things that homeless families are eligible for, and even how we identify them and supports that we have to provide to them, they're all outlined in this act. And so sometimes you'll even hear it referred to as like a McKinneyVento liaison, and they even leave out homelessness. And so I just felt like that's a really good kind of buzzword to think about and maybe read up more on. It has been changed slightly throughout the years. And one key thing that it did in 2001 was mandate that there be homeless liaisons in every district. And so this is important because no matter where you're watching this from, your district has somebody that is deemed your homeless liaison. Now, in larger districts like Omaha Public Schools, I know that they have somebody who their job title is the homeless liaison. And so they are, navigating homeless situations and setting up services through their school social workers and school counselors, but they are helping navigate that for the entire district. In smaller districts, it might just be a job, one of the job duties for somebody else. For example, in my district, our student services director is the homeless liaison. But obviously he would even tell you that the school social workers are the ones that are out there working with the families. And then we would go to him and say, hey, I've got this family, here's the situation. And I think they should be coded as homeless, but he is the one that actually deems them as homeless within our district. Then there is also a homeless liaison, I call her the expert, at the Nebraska Department of Ed. And so there are, like I said, and I will go back to there's a lot of vagueness in this act. And so that's good because it leaves a little bit of gray area for us to kind of make some things fit. But it's also really hard because none of us are investigators or trained in how to identify certain things or when to code a certain family and not. And obviously there are some that are obvious, but some that aren't so obvious. And so it's really helpful for us to have somebody even outside of our district that we can go to for kind of the final answer, who's an expert in this and will highlight the parts of the act that tell us exactly what we need to do. And that is really helpful too, because it's not necessarily left up to like one person's discretion. Okay, so next is really to define homelessness. We know that we have to provide something to these families, but how do we define this? And I challenge everybody that's watching, listening to really think when you heard the topic of today, what kind of images came to mind for you? What do you think of when you think of homelessness? And I think for most of us, that would be people that we see on the side of the road that are holding up signs, people that maybe are living within the shelters that we might donate things to, people living on in tents that don't have a home. They don't have any place to stay or a roof over their head. And while those things absolutely are homelessness, especially when we're talking about what qualifies you within a school district, it is a much broader term. And so I actually really struggle with the word homelessness when we're talking about the McKinney-Vento Act. And in fact, sometimes kind of leave it out and talk about it in a different way, because a lot of families, even who, when I'm talking to them about services they could qualify, can get easily offended because they don't see themselves as homeless, and in fact really aren't, because they have a home, but are eligible and actually do qualify in accordance with the McKinney-Vento Act. So let's talk a little bit about some of these. So youth who are sharing housing with other people are doubled up. This is probably the bulk of the families and students that I work with that I classify as homeless are what we call doubled up. So these are families where I just had one this week. There is something going on within the family. The father had to kind of unexpectedly pack up, separate from mom because there are some safety issues. He is now staying with the children's aunt and uncle, his, I think, brother and sister-in-law. And so they live within our district, and because of some other issues, they need to transfer to our district. And so this family actually has all of their things. They have beds to sleep in. They're with relatives, but this is not their permanent residence, and it's actually temporary while they are looking for another home living situation. And so they are classified as homeless. Living in motels, campgrounds, shelters, those sometimes are the easy ones to identify. Obviously, parks, cars, outdoor spaces. Migratory children are listed as well. I would say that to me, this is probably the most underreported segment of these definitions, because, and we'll talk about this later, there is a lot of trust that has to be built for families and students to either self-identify or to disclose some things about their situation. I mean, in general, I would say that we don't know, we're underreporting the homeless population within our districts, because there are many, many, many that go unreported because we don't know, and because the child or the family doesn't tell us. And so this would be an area where if a family was here and depending on their legal status would not necessarily share that information with us, but if they did, could qualify. We have also had a few years ago a family that was in another country and their home was destroyed by a hurricane, and so they moved to the United States to live with relatives, and so they were coded as homeless when they enrolled with us. Unaccompanied minor. Because I'm out of high school, this is also one that I use a lot. An unaccompanied minor would be somebody who is not living with their parents. And so this is a hard one because I think the first thought that most people have is, well, what do you mean they're not living with their parents? Because you have to live with your parents. Your parents have to take care of you. And that is true. However, keep in mind that students are eligible to be in school until 21. And so we do have older youth that come to us and that are in our district that maybe are living on their own and they don't have a parent. They would qualify as an unaccompanied minor. There's also situations where students are living with other relatives or other friends, parents of friends, and their parents know where they are, but it becomes really clear that living in their parents' house is not healthy for anybody. And that in fact, the safer, more stable alternative is to be with these other people. And so sometimes that's like, okay, well, there needs to be something formal signed. We need to get some guardianship paperwork, or in our district, it's called the responsible adult form, to make this kind of official so that these people that this student is staying with have access to some things like medical care and stuff. And so that might be something that I help the family work on. Like I'm calling the biological parent, and working with them saying, hey, you really need to sign this paperwork so we can communicate with these people. But in that time, they are homeless. And I think that's something I failed to mention too, is that you are homeless if you meet any of these criteria for even one day. So if you are, doubled up or had to live in a motel because you got evicted for one night, but then found another place, you actually would qualify for the remainder of the school year, even for just that one night. And then the last one is runaway. And I chuckle a little bit because this is my 15th year in the district, and I distinctly remember the first time that I had a student that ran away, and my student services director at the time was telling me that I needed to code him as homeless. And I was like, why? They found him and he was at a friend's house and the police let him stay there for kind of a cooling off period before going home. And I'm like, he's not homeless. He has a place to go and his parents are welcoming him home. They want him home, but he won't go. But it was, again, it was made clear to me at that time that it really wasn't a choice, that it's outlined here that if you are a runaway, that you are, that you qualify for homeless services. And also it's been a learning curve because I realize now too that sometimes the running away is a symptom of other things that are going on. And I'm not even saying that that's always at the fault of the parent, but that sometimes the better alternative is to have a cooling off period or some time away, or just it's better off for a variety of reasons in somebody else's house. And so in that way you would qualify. These are the terms that we use in order to classify somebody. But again, like I said, it's not always simple about who would qualify for this. For the example that I was giving earlier, the family that is here now because there's a separation from a parent. When I called them to ask some follow-up questions because they're trying to enroll with us, I do not know these people at all. They're brand new to our district. And I'm really just trying to figure out if they qualify because it would help their enrollment process. And I'll get to that in a minute. But what I could piece together was that the father had left with the children. They're now doubled up with the aunt and uncle, but mom might still be in their house that they were all living in. And so I was a little confused because I thought, well, if they're able to go to their mom and stay there, there's no safety concern, then they wouldn't necessarily be homeless if dad just chose to take them to aunt and uncle's. And I didn't get the whole story, and I didn't expect to because I don't know these people. But that was one that I had to take to my student services director because I felt like, well, technically they're doubled up. And so I think that they qualify, but I just want to make sure that, because mom has a stable living situation, that I just want to make sure I wasn't making a mistake there. So I guess that's just an example of sometimes where it seems so simple, but then you'll get something, there's a gray area, and it's always nice to have somebody that is can help you make that determination. So that leads us to how do we even identify these students and families? We know who qualifies, so how do we identify them? And I touched on two key things already. And number one is building trust. I can't, say it enough that the only way that I find out some of this information is not only the trust that I build with families, but that the trust that these families and students build with other staff members within our school, who see things, who hear things, who see things written in a paper, and they know that something's not right. And so then the student discloses to them, or they overhear something that the student is saying to somebody else, and so they know to contact me. Beyond that, our district now has gone to a completely online enrollment, and one of the boxes that you check is, do you believe that your family is would qualify for homeless services or something like that? And it outlines, it specifically outlines like doubled up living with somebody else, living in a motel or shelter. And so if the family checks that box, it automatically sends me an email with their name and contact information if they're in my school building. And so I would know to contact them to reach out, because some people mark it by accident, or they're doubled up, but it doesn't necessarily meet the criteria. And so we just have to reach out and then determine that. I did forget to go over one key piece of this last slide. Individuals who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence due to financial hardship, which includes these things. So when we talk specifically about like motels and doubled up, one scenario that presents itself often is a family that, like myself, I built a house, sold my other one, didn't have a place to live in that time. I always joked, with my student services director, that if I had to stay a few nights in a hotel, that I wanted my kids classified as homeless. Probably not a very funny joke, but I would not qualify because there was no financial barrier here. And I would say more than financial, we focus on the word hardship. So an example of that would be, we had a family who was displaced because they had a house fire, and they had to stay a few nights in a hotel before they were able to get into an apartment. Very well off family. Did not need anything, had insurance and money and a lot of family support. And, other than having to be in, a hotel for a few nights and then an apartment that they didn't want to be in, they were getting their house, restored before they moved back in. They were classified as homeless because there was a hardship. And although they could afford those things, it was an unexpected change to their lifestyle, and it was a hardship on them that they had to stay in this hotel for a few nights and figure out transportation and all of that. So I just wanted to make that classification, because that sometimes is the stuff that will come to us that we have to unpack a little bit about the hardship and the financial barrier versus just solely the living situation. One key component here too is foster youth. They are not, foster care in and of itself does not qualify you for homeless, because you have, you're awarded the state, so you have the guardian and they have deemed a placement for you. However, a lot of times the trajectory to getting to foster care is being in a temporary living situation or a shelter. So if there's no foster home available and you had to go stay a few nights at a shelter while while a foster home opened up, you would qualify for homeless, and you would qualify for it for the rest of the school year, even if it was only for a few nights. We've had a few sad situations where students were dropped off. We have an agency up here called Project Harmony, and they have what's called like a triage center. So it's really not intended for an overnight stay, but sometimes students land there for long hours while they figure out placement. And so they would qualify for homeless, even if they only stayed there for that one night. Um, a lot of times these students are identified in really roundabout ways, and it comes out because of the things that you can qualify for. So one of those things is some transportation barriers, and you find out that they're no longer living near the school. And so you start asking questions and you figure out why they're not living with parents. And so it's like, okay, well, let's get you to the school social worker or to somebody to see if we can figure out more about what's going on. And also, I would say outside agencies are becoming more familiar with this material. And so probation, for example, might have a student that is either placed in a shelter or winds up in a shelter. And so they'll call me and say, I think this student is eligible for X, Y, and Z, because they know now that students that are at a shelter would qualify for that. Also, places like shelters will call us and say, we have a family here, a student here, and we know they'll kind of coach the family that, hey, you need to contact your school district and tell them this because there are certain things that you can get. And so that, again, things like this and educating other people is why that's important, because the more people that know, the more that can encourage families who might be okay sharing the information, but not understand why it would be so important to share with the school district. Knowledge is power in that regard. Okay. All right. So then we're going to talk about, okay, so you're coded as homeless. We know now how you qualify. So what does that mean? What do we need to provide for you? And the number one thing, and then I think the real reason why the McKinney-Vento Act was started was to provide school stability. That when you have families that have unstable housing, that have frequent unstable housing, it is not in that child or family's best interest to make them keep switching schools after school after school. And the way a lot of districts, enrollment practices are is that you have to live within the district or you have to apply by certain times to remain there. And so it offers protections in that regard. So it does specifically say that children and youth who are experiencing homelessness can remain in their school of origin for the duration of the homelessness or until the end of that academic year. I would also extend that to say that it really is about school choice. And so if the family said, if the family was in my district and they moved 20 miles away, doubled up with family, and they didn't want to stay in our district, but wanted to be close to where they were currently staying, even though that wasn't their permanent residence. So they would not have proof of residency to show to that school. They would be eligible to enroll as long as they were deemed homeless. And so that helps too. It kind of expedites a little bit the enrollment process, because like bullet number 2 says that homeless children and youth must be enrolled in school immediately, even if they lack the documents or have missed application or enrollment deadlines. This is probably the one that I get the most pushback for amongst people who are helping enroll students. And it's not in anybody's fault. There's no blame, but there are a lot of things that are required of a student and family in order to enroll. And that's for everybody's safety. Things like birth certificates, so we know, who your parents are and that you're there, who are bringing you, and that they approve of this. Immunization records, a lot of the health screenings and things. And the reality is that if you are a homeless student, those things are not easily accessible, especially if something happened really unexpectedly or things were destroyed. Those things are not easy to access. And so we have to allow them to enroll even without them. And that is really hard because there are a lot of rules surrounding those documents and a lot of training that goes into what you need. And I know a lot of people could get in trouble if they didn't get those. And then you've got me who's like, yeah, but this family, they don't have to, and we have to let them in. And so Again, this goes back to a lot of education and training, especially with my secretaries and the people in charge of enrollment and registration, helping them to understand that when they're meeting with the family, often then they say, yeah, there's something going on. I think you need to come into this meeting because I think this family might be homeless, and that might help expedite this process because we're waiting on all this paperwork that I don't think they have access to right now. Now, they do still need to provide that stuff. It's not like we're saying you don't need to ever provide us, and the district can kind of set a deadline and help them out with that process, but they do not have to have it in order to start school. And then the third and probably most really important thing, I think, because it is the biggest barrier, at least for in my district, is transportation to the school of origin is required until the end of the academic year, or until they, and when a student obtains permanent housing, I'm sorry. So even if they obtain permanent housing, like in, let's say they get evicted, they're living in motels, but then in March they find an apartment and they get to stay in our district and get transportation from that apartment, even though it's their permanent residence, through the remainder of the school year. This gets a little bit tricky. I had a situation at the semester where this happened, and so then they got permanent housing and the family is eligible for transportation back to us. And this was a 9th grade student. And I had to make sure that this mother understood that I would set up the transportation and they were eligible for it, but that next year, this student would no longer be eligible, meaning she would either have to find a way to get her son clear across town to our school, or he would have to transfer eventually. And I just wanted her and that student to have that conversation to kind of know, would he rather transfer now, if this is where they're going to be staying, or would he, like to continue out the remainder of the school year? And so sometimes knowing that too helps the family be able to make the best decision for them. I'm going to show this quick video. It's only the first couple minutes because I think it brings up some really good talking points about what happens once somebody is identified.
Next, how a school district in Kansas is grappling with the problems of homeless students. PBS special correspondent Lisa Stark of our partner Education Week reports. It's part of our weekly series, Making the Grade.
Let's go, keep the ball in bounds.
It's varsity basketball practice at Schlegel High School in Kansas City, Kansas. And 6'6" senior Malik Kashan is the tallest guy on the team, determined on the court and off.
I just had to set my mind to it, had to be focused, real focused, to get back where I needed to be.
Back from a place he never expected to find himself. A few months ago, Malik had nowhere to live.
Me and my mother had a little miscommunication, and one word led to another. I don't want to get too deep into it because I still love my mother, but it just wasn't right at the moment, so she just kicked me out. All right, start over.
Did you realize he was homeless?
I did not know. I did not know.
How did you find out?
He told me. He told me through a text message.
But by the time Malik told Coach Prentice Potts what was going on, he was sleeping on a friend's floor and had missed nearly a month of school, a common problem for homeless students who are more likely to fall behind and drop out.
If I'm jumping from place to place, I'm not as focused on my schoolwork. I got to think about what I'm eating for the night. I got to think about how bills going to get paid. I got to think about all this extra stuff. It blew me away. Excuse me, I'm getting choked up. It blew me away for the simple fact is he never communicated anything like that, and his spirits are always so high. You never could tell by looking at him that that's what he was going through. My little sister, my big brother.
Malik now lives in housing for homeless youth and gets services from the school district. Under federal law, districts must identify homeless students, those on the streets, doubled up in motels and shelters, or like Malik, on their own.
Did you do the intake with Miss Marie?
Districts must also have a homeless liaison. Here, that's Carrie Rennick. Her job is to make sure homeless students have the support they need to stay in school.
We provide educational services to make sure that kids get enrolled in school, get transportation back and forth to school, and then just kind of ensuring that their everyday needs are met.
Student homelessness is a widespread problem. Nearly 1 in 4 school districts in the U.S. gets federal grant money to help provide services for homeless students. And that money is stretched thin. It amounts to an average of $50 per student. So the district also counts on outside help.
Everything in here is donated.
This room overflows with supplies for homeless students and families. This is one of the poorest districts in Kansas. This year, the school district expects to help more than 1,000 homeless students, nearly 5% of the student population. Over time, the solution became clear. To help homeless students, they needed to help homeless families.
I had to come to the realization that I wasn't doing enough. That although everything that I was doing was well intended, I was putting a Band-Aid on things.
In 2015, Rennick put out a call for help. 27 groups responded, nonprofits, civic groups, state agencies.
I think the level of collaboration is very unusual.
Okay. That video is really good and actually goes on to describe a program that they set up, but that is not local to us. But I felt like this did a really good job of capturing why and how this data that we collect and why classifying students and families as homeless is really actually even more important than just the actual family. So I always say that, we probably, there's a lot of families that don't go, that go unnoticed, unrecorded, undocumented as far as homeless services. And that's unfortunate. And I don't feel in any way, shape, or form that my district or any other district is trying not to identify families. It is expensive, that they are providing transportation. And I forgot to mention too, that they are then eligible for free and reduced lunch for the remainder of that school year. And so it certainly isn't necessarily free, for what we do. And there's also costs associated with the support that we offer to these families. And so the numbers that we report to the state, we do get some very minimal reimbursement. However, the data that we collect, that our districts collect, help immensely in so many, in a much broader way to help some of the programming I think that the community helps us with. And so I thought that was really great how they captured that here. When we can report our homeless numbers, then I can use that data to, for example, go to a community partnership that we have that helps us in a variety of ways to say, here's a need that we have. Let me give you the numbers that we have in just our high school, and here's some of their situations. And so they helped us this year, for example, get hygiene bags for some of our older youth that struggle with homelessness. And I was able to provide them, really easily with the number that we currently had, because that's something that we document for reimbursement purposes. And so I just always think that that's important to point out as well, that it's not always just about that family that we're working with. It's about, just in a greater sense, helping the community, helping our district representatives understand the real issues that we're dealing with. I speak, from a community in Sarpy County that is very well off. And so a lot of people don't believe that there is any homelessness. We also don't have any shelters in our community. And so when you look at like community numbers of homelessness, it's 0, because there's really no way to code them, because they're not going to shelters. And if they are found, they're taken, to Douglas County. And so it's really kind of an interesting way that the school is actually helping to support the cause of providing more homeless services within my county. So I just thought that that was a good point to make as well. And also what I liked about it is that this information came through a coach. It goes back again to that relationship building. I get a lot of information from coaches and club sponsors, because they see who's coming to pick up the student. They see that the student doesn't have a ride. Well, why don't you have a ride? Well, we moved. Where are you living? And then it kind of gets to that they're not really at home anymore, and that they live too far away and there's nobody that can give them a ride. And so then they reach out to me and we see if they're eligible for things. The unfortunate thing is that the transportation services do not extend to extracurricular activities. And so If we have students who are in any sports or activities, clubs, then they have to find their own ride home. They would be able to get to school, but then we wouldn't be able to provide that transportation home afterwards. The one little caveat to that is that if you can tie it to academics, we have been able to provide students transportation home from things like tutoring that would be after school. So, okay. And so along those same lines, there are certain things that we have to provide, the transportation, the free lunch, letting them come without some of their documentation for enrollment. But then, like I talked about, there are other things then that we can provide. And so that McKinney-Vento Act just kind of vaguely states that the school will work with the family to either find permanent housing or financial resources as needed. So it's very vague, but there are certain things now because we've identified this that we can, or because we have shared our numbers that we have access to. And so a really simple example of that is that we get some produce boxes every week. And so it's very easy to look at the list, and those are some fresh fruits and vegetables that I can provide to families, or that I at least can say, hey, here's a service that isn't really advertised to the community, but you can show up here and you can get it yourself. And so we just did that today. It's a really cool thing. The other, behind the scenes stuff that goes on is, for example, we had a Zoom call with some outreach people from OPPD regarding electric bills. And so they shared with us some information about kind of cutoff notices, and right now, because of COVID, some protections for remote learners. But ultimately, what came out of this is a partnership for us to be able to sign like a non-disclosure agreement with OPPD. So if a family gives us permission and they're behind on a bill, or they need services reset up at their permanent housing, but had, they have an outstanding bill that we need to help pay for, we can call as a school representative and say, we're helping this family. Can you give us this information? Because we're trying to help them find some permanent housing, or we're trying to help them, in a variety of other ways that extends beyond just homelessness. But those are some of the cool things that happen behind the scenes that aren't necessarily as obvious to most people that work within a school, that are some cool things that we can provide once we know that a family is struggling in any way and not just homelessness. And then I talked about free lunches for the remainder of the year. And then one key point too is that you are eligible for these services from preschool up to 21. And so that is something that is newer, is that the inclusion of like the Head Start services. So we often do have families where maybe older siblings, we find out that older siblings that they've been evicted, but they have a student in preschool. And so they're eligible for that transportation to and from that as well. I always say transportation because that is something that comes up a lot, is the barrier to transportation and to getting to school. And I will say too, is sometimes this comes out at like attendance meetings. And so you're talking to a family and they don't, it becomes clear that transportation is a barrier. And when you start talking to them about why, it's because of a situation that happened and they had to move unexpectedly. Some special considerations that I want to talk about. I just feel like you can't do a presentation like this without really talking about it. LGBTQ young youth I last read a statistic, they're 120% more likely to experience homelessness than their non-LGBTQ peers. And so that's something that I think that we just have to keep reminding ourselves of, probably paying special attention to and doing more outreach to. And I know that there are some communities or some agencies that I work with that do just that. Foster youth and former wards, and while they might not necessarily qualify once they are in foster care, a lot of times when we're talking through some of these situations, I talk to you sometimes about that unaccompanied minor, and sometimes, okay, they have a safe, stable place to live, but it isn't with their parents. Sometimes it's not that, and sometimes it is neglect. And so they can be coded as homeless, but that also might turn into a hotline report. And so that's part of the information of gathering, but they would still qualify for homeless services, even if they were placed in foster care. The running away, we did talk about. Rural areas, I think it's just worth mentioning that it's harder maybe to identify some of these students because there is a lack of programming for outreach. And so again, it's kind of like I talked about in my county, there aren't any shelters. And so there's definitely not any referrals coming from shelters within my community saying, hey, you've got this family here. It would require people from just outside of our district knowing who they could contact within our district. And we have built those relationships over time, but it is harder in rural areas to identify those families. And also Native American families too. I do think that there has been, there are some cultural norms that prevent families maybe from sharing or wanting to share all of the information about their living situation. And so I know that that is a specific population that goes underreported as well. So I did just want to talk a little bit about some resources. I know that people all over the state are probably watching this, so I tried to pick some from all over. And within the Omaha area, we have the Yes House, and that is a shelter for youth who are homeless, and they also do some outreach. They also have a maternity group home separate from their shelter that helps students who are pregnant or parenting and experiencing homeless. Cedars Outreach, I know, is a program within Lincoln that also has some shelter and outreach services. And then the Community Action Partnership of Western Nebraska is who would maybe serve some of our Western counties. If you are somewhere and you're like, I have never heard of these and I don't know what who I would call if I knew a family that was experiencing homelessness, my best suggestion would be that Boys Town hotline, because they are accustomed to helping youth that are experiencing homelessness, and they would know about resources all throughout the state of Nebraska. Sometimes these services are a little hard to access because my definition of homelessness and the one that we talk about at a school is not the program's definition of homelessness. And so that's something to keep in mind as well. Also, sometimes you can see and and families are begging and pleading with you because they are on the cusp of homelessness. We know that it's happening. They have an eviction notice and they have nowhere to go. And unfortunately, some programs require you to actually be homeless before they can kick in and help. I would say that in the last year, and maybe that's, there was some flooding here, and I remember that was really, there were some things that came out of that, and maybe with COVID too, where I have noticed kind of a shift in some of the resources that we utilize, that as long as you have an eviction notice or somebody helps determine that you are, that homelessness is imminent, that they will step in and help to try to keep you where you are. And that's amazing, because preventing a family, young kids, from going to a shelter or really anywhere that's not their home, we know is not best for them. So that's been really kind of a neat thing to see in the last couple of years. And sometimes it's working through families too on kind of the right things to say. Like, hey, when you're calling these, this is what you need to exactly tell them. Sometimes that's my role too, because if you don't tell them this information, you're going to screen out. And so here are the words that you need to say, does become part of my role as well. And lastly, I just wanted to talk, this is a really important piece as well, for the high schools especially. I don't think a lot of people know this. If your school district has coded you as homeless during your high school career, that allows you to fill out the FAFSA as an independent. And that is a really important thing when you are a family, or when you are a student who is not engaged with your parents, or parents are struggling for any reason. The FAFSA is a huge barrier because of the documents that it requires of the student to gather from their parents, and some that parents are unwilling to give. And so if you can fill it out as an independent, it means it only goes off of your income and you can fill it out by yourself. And actually, this is one way that students are identified at the high school level, is they're going to fill out their FAFSA and they can't get these things. So then the college counselor is talking to them about why not. And we realize that they are not living at home. What's really unfortunate is sometimes, and it's happened a few times, where students have transferred into us. And because they were homeless in their last district, they came to us, where they now are staying with like an aunt and uncle, for example. And we realized that the last district never coded them as homeless, so they don't qualify for these things. And we can't code them as homeless when they weren't homeless within our school district. And so you just realize it's just kind of hard for me sometimes to realize that if we had identified them, if they had identified them, this process would be so much easier for them. It also makes them generally Pell Grant eligible. So not only can they file as an independent, but their income obviously is extremely low. And so they're Pell Grant eligible almost automatically. And so we just provide a document. Sometimes colleges will ask us their financial aid office, and I'll just write a letter that we have coded them as homeless. So how you can help identify students is really to educate yourself and others about this McKinney-Vento Act. And I think most importantly, broaden your definition of homelessness as it pertains to students. And then identify who your district's homeless liaison is. It might not be obvious if you're in a district that doesn't have a school social worker, or you have somebody at your district office that wears many roles. I would start with that student services, somebody who's in charge of the student services, and talk to them about who is it that's the expert within your district. And then when you have students that you do question or you don't know, referring the students and families to that building level person that can help identify what they qualify for. I'm thinking we might have a question. Well, no questions. Okay, so that is, to me, in a nutshell, what homeless services are. Like I said, there are so many situations where I don't know how I would identify them, and I just really lean on the other people. Like I talked about, sometimes families don't want to be coded as homeless. They're like, I'm fine and I don't need this. And I've just, been told time and time again that we have to just keep an accurate record, and I would agree with that. If we've got families that are eligible, then we're going to at least code it that way so that we can give an accurate portrayal to other people and to other providers on who might be eligible for what. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this. It certainly is a topic that is near and dear into my heart. And I think that as you maybe do a little bit more investigating within your own district, you will find that there are people who are really well versed in this in your district, and that could probably provide you with a lot more relevant information specific to your district. So thank you for taking the time. I do appreciate you guys reaching out.